Zhang Han had never been a man of adventure. He didn't find joy in thrill-seeking, didn't dream of grandiose feats or heroic battles. At the ripe age of 29, he was living the life of a perfectly average man in a perfectly average world, surrounded by perfectly average people. If there was one thing Han prided himself on, it was his consistency. In the mornings, he woke up on time. He dressed in his standard white-collar attire, with the same modest tie every day. He always packed his lunch, a simple sandwich, nothing fancy. His job at the office was as mind-numbing as they come: data entry, spreadsheets, and never-ending meetings that could make a person forget they had a pulse. Most days, Han spent his lunch breaks at a nearby park, walking aimlessly, lost in thought, feeling the rush of the wind against his face, wishing for something, anything, to shake up the monotony. But nothing ever did. He wasn't special. He wasn't extraordinary. He was just Han. That was until the day it all changed. It was a Thursday, the kind of Thursday that whispered that Friday was close, but never quite close enough. Han had just finished his lunch when an argument broke out in the office. The usual cast of characters was involved: Mr. Yang, the overbearing boss who thought wearing too many colognes made him a superior human being, and his underling, Qin Li, whose constant, robotic smiles always gave Han the creeps. Han didn't care much for office politics, so he was busy scribbling down meaningless numbers on his notepad, tuning out the bickering. But suddenly, there was a shift in the air, a jolt of static electricity that made his skin prickle. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, like an itch in the very depths of his soul. Then, without warning, Mr. Yang snapped at Qin Li with a sharp gesture, knocking over a stack of files. The sound of the falling papers was like the trigger for something much larger, something beyond the confines of the office, something from deep inside Han. He felt an involuntary surge of anger rising in him, burning hotter than he had ever felt in his life. In an instant, Han was up from his desk, his hands clenched into fists. Before he could even think about it, he was lunging toward Yang, and with a single, mighty shove, sent him crashing into the row of filing cabinets. The room fell silent. Everyone stared. "What the hell, Zhang?" Yang sputtered, looking up from the pile of papers. He had a look of shock, but Han wasn't looking at him anymore. His pulse was pounding in his ears, his vision had sharpened, every detail, every movement, was magnified. He could hear the faint hum of the lights above him, the click of the office door, even the quiet breaths of his co-workers. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had done it. He had thrown Yang across the room like it was nothing. And it hadn't been an accident. It was controlled, deliberate. He could have stopped himself, but he didn't. "What's going on with you?" Qin Li whispered, but Han couldn't hear her words. He felt the primal urge to fight, to defend himself, to assert his dominance. Suddenly, his body was his enemy. His hands trembled as if they were no longer his own. The sensation faded almost as quickly as it came, leaving him standing there in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, utterly confused. The next morning, Zhang Han tried to tell himself it was just stress. Maybe he hadn't been sleeping well. Maybe the fight had been a result of too much caffeine, or some other trivial excuse he could pin the outburst on. But nothing made sense. His body felt different. More awake, more alive. His senses were sharper. Colors were more vivid, the air was clearer, and the sounds around him were so crisp he could hear the distant chatter of people on the street as if they were standing beside him. The weight of the world had shifted, and Han didn't know how to carry it. He rubbed his eyes and sighed. Just get through today. Focus on the numbers. Just get through it. But something had changed, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. As the days passed, Han noticed more and more strange occurrences. His reflexes were unnaturally fast. At first, it was little things: he could catch a falling pen before it hit the ground, or swipe his phone from the edge of his desk without thinking. Then came the more troubling signs. While walking home one evening, a stray dog barked at him from across the street, and Han instinctively crouched, his body coiling like a spring, ready to pounce. His heart raced. He hadn't even meant to do it, it was pure instinct, as if his body knew what to do before his mind could process it. The next day, a sharp pain in his lower back sent him stumbling into the bathroom, where he saw the first real change. His skin, beneath his shirt, was covered in patches of rough, scaly skin. It looked as if he had the start of a rash, but it wasn't like anything he had ever seen. His fingers trembled as he touched the patches. They felt almost reptilian. He had no idea what was happening to him. "Han," a voice called out. "You okay in there?" He looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his presence suddenly striking. It was Professor Yuan, an older man with silver hair and a faint glint of knowing in his eyes, someone Han had never met before, yet somehow, felt he should have known for a long time. "Who are you?" Han asked, his voice hoarse. "I'm here to explain some things to you, Zhang Han. What's happening to you right now isn't normal." Yuan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something specific. "What's happening to me?" Han repeated, trying to steady his breath. "The truth," Professor Yuan began, "is that you are not simply human, Han. You carry within you a very ancient power. The bloodline you belong to is that of a warrior race, a mix of human and dinosaur. Your ancestors were not just men, they were genetically fused with the creatures that ruled the Earth millions of years ago." Han's head spun. "Dinosaur warriors?" Professor Yuan nodded. "Yes, exactly. You're the last of a line of powerful beings who could transform into something beyond human. But something went wrong centuries ago. Your kind vanished. Now, the gene is reawakening in you." It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. But as Han stared at the old man, he felt a sudden, cold clarity. He could feel it deep in his bones, the power that had always been there, waiting to emerge. The strange sensations, the changes to his body, the primal urges, they weren't just his imagination. They were real. "You need to understand what you're becoming," Professor Yuan said, his voice solemn. "You're not just some average guy. You're a dinosaur warrior, and that power is both a blessing and a curse." Han looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching. He had to admit, there was no denying it anymore. His life had just been thrown into a completely new direction. He wasn't ready. But he didn't have a choice. The next few days were a blur of strange training sessions, wild transformations, and too many moments when Han felt completely out of control. Under Yuan's guidance, he began to unlock parts of himself that he never knew existed. He could feel the instincts of a predator coursing through him. He could smell the air, track movements, and sense danger long before it arrived. It was exhilarating, but it was terrifying too. The dinosaur powers that now lived inside him weren't something he could control, not yet anyway. They were raw, chaotic. It was on the third day of his training that it happened again. The third day of training felt like everything was crumbling under the weight of what Han was becoming. He stood in front of Professor Yuan, sweating heavily, trying to focus on the task at hand. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the sharpness in his senses. His body was no longer his own. His skin felt hot, pulsing, as though something deep inside was ready to break free. "Focus, Han," Yuan's voice came sharply, cutting through the haze of Han's thoughts. "You can't let the dinosaur side take over. Control it, or it will control you." Han gritted his teeth. "I'm trying," he shouted, but the words barely left his mouth before the change hit him again. The transformation wasn't something that could be stopped once it had begun. His body twitched, his spine arched, and the next thing he knew, his teeth were elongating, his senses blurring as his sight grew sharper, more primal. His fingers dug into the earth below him, nails turning into claws, his breath shallow, frantic. He could hear the distant flutter of wings, the rustle of leaves, the heartbeat of the professor standing in front of him. He let out a guttural growl, and a part of him, the rational, human part, screamed at him to stop. But the beast inside him was gaining control, roaring to take over. "No." Han grunted, clenching his fists until the knuckles turned white. He staggered back, fighting against the flood of instincts that were drowning him. I can't keep doing this. Ruan's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, his face calm. You have to learn to tame the power, or it will consume you, Han. You were born for this. The bloodline runs deep in you. You can control it. Han's vision swirled. The room was shifting before him. The professor's voice felt like it was coming from miles away, muffled beneath the sound of his own heartbeat. The growl escaped him again, louder this time. His muscles tensed, his body filling with a raw energy he couldn't understand. The power inside him was terrifying and beautiful all at once, but it was too much to handle. I don't want this. Han shouted, almost pleading, but his words felt foreign, disconnected from the world around him. You don't get a choice, Ruan replied, his voice unwavering. You are this. And you will learn to master it, or it will destroy you. And anyone close to you. A surge of panic gripped Han's chest. Li Mei. He thought of her instantly. She was his only real friend, the one person who had never seen him as anything other than, well, normal. He had to get control of himself. He had to. The beast within him stilled, just for a moment, as if it was waiting for permission. Han took a deep breath, grounding himself, trying to focus on his human side, trying to remember the simple things, the sound of his own voice, the familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. He closed his eyes and fought the impulse to shift again, forcing the growing power back down, away from the surface. His body trembled with the effort, but he held it back, just enough to regain control. The transformation stopped. Han stood there, panting heavily, sweat dripping from his forehead, his hands shaking at his sides. He opened his eyes, looking at Ruan, who nodded in approval. You did it, the professor said quietly. For now. For the next few days, Han trained with more focus. But the tension never fully left. Every moment, every interaction with Ruan, felt like a reminder of how close he was to losing control. It was a tightrope walk, each step a gamble, each breath a struggle to stay human. But there was something else too, something darker. The knowledge that this power could change everything. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Han found himself alone in the courtyard of the old building where Ruan had been hiding him. He sat on the edge of a stone bench, staring up at the clear night sky, lost in thought. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but the quiet, peaceful night felt miles away from the chaos inside him. He thought about Li Mei again. He hadn't seen her since the transformation started. He couldn't bear the thought of her finding out. What would she say? What could he even say to her? Just as his thoughts threatened to spiral, a shadow fell over him. Han looked up sharply, his instincts kicking in before he could even think. Han. A voice called softly, and Han's heart leaped in his chest. That it was Li Mei. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. She looked concerned. But there was something else in her eyes too. Something that made his chest tighten. Han hadn't expected to see her here, but in a way, he had. Somehow, he knew she wouldn't stay away forever. What are you doing here? Han asked, forcing himself to sound casual, though his voice came out a little too rough. I should ask you the same thing, Li Mei replied, her gaze scanning his face. I've been looking for you. You've been avoiding me, haven't you? Han shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. He wasn't ready to explain the changes, the violence he was capable of, or the dark power he was learning to control. I've been busy, he said, forcing a smile. Just, a lot going on at work. You know how it is. Li Mei wasn't buying it. She stepped closer, tilting her head to the side. Really? Because I don't think that's all it is. She looked down at the bench beside him. I was worried about you. The warmth of her voice made Han's heart ache, but he pushed the feeling away. There's nothing to worry about, Mei. Everything's fine. She didn't look convinced. Han, you can't keep pushing people away. I'm your friend. You don't have to go through this alone. Han swallowed hard. The urge to tell her everything, to explain, to let her in, was overwhelming. But something held him back. What if she couldn't accept it? What if the beast inside him was too much for her to handle? Before he could say anything, Ruan's voice rang out from behind them. Li Mei, I think it's time you knew the truth. Han's stomach dropped. Li Mei turned, surprised. The truth? Ruan stepped forward, his expression grim. Yes. Han is not who you think he is. What he's been hiding from you is that he's not just a man. He's something far older, something far more dangerous. Han's breath caught in his throat. Ruan, no. But the professor held up a hand, silencing him. It's time for her to know, Han. She deserves the truth. Li Mei's eyes darted back and forth between the two of them. What are you talking about? What's going on? Han closed his eyes, fighting the growing panic. He had to tell her. He couldn't lie anymore. Slowly, he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. Mei, listen, there's something I need to show you. With that, he turned, his back to her, and braced himself for the confession that was about to change everything. The air around Han was thick with tension as he turned slowly to face Li Mei, his heart racing. She stood there, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression caught between confusion and concern. It was the look of someone who had just learned their entire world was a lie. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Was she terrified? Disappointed? Or did she, like him, feel the strange pull of destiny? Mei, he said softly, trying to find his voice. He needed to explain. Needed her to understand, but he didn't know how. The beast inside him stirred again, as if it too was waiting to be revealed. It felt like his entire body was a battleground, torn between the human side that wanted to keep her safe and the primal side that wanted to drag her into the chaos. What's going on, Han? Li Mei's voice cracked, the rawness of it pulling at something deep within him. Why didn't you tell me? Why have you been hiding this? His lips parted, but no words came out. He could feel Ruan's presence like a weight on his shoulders, urging him to tell the truth, to be honest with her. He had been running for so long, terrified of what he had become. But the time had come. There was no going back now. I didn't know how, he said, his voice strained. I thought if I ignored it, maybe it would go away. But it's not going away. It's a part of me now. Li Mei took a tentative step forward, her eyes narrowing, not with fear, but with something more complicated, curiosity, concern, and the faintest spark of disbelief. Part of you? What are you talking about? Her voice grew quieter, as if trying to understand the weight of his words. What are you? Han turned away, unable to look her in the eye. He couldn't. Not when everything was about to change. I'm not just a man, he murmured. I'm part of something ancient. Something that shouldn't exist. Something I don't even understand yet. Han, you're scaring me, Li Mei said, her voice trembling. What are you trying to tell me? Ruan stepped in, his face unreadable. You deserve to know, Li Mei. All of you do. He paused, his eyes meeting Han's briefly, then continuing. Han here isn't just any man. He's the last of an ancient bloodline. A warrior race that once combined human and dinosaur genes. He has the power to transform into something beyond what you know as human. Li Mei's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Han, then back to Ruan, her mind racing to process the absurdity of the situation. Wait, are you saying Han has dinosaur DNA? Yes, Ruan answered. He has the blood of creatures long extinct coursing through his veins. The power to become something like them, to tap into their strength, their instincts. It's a gift, but it's also a curse. One that he's learning to control, if we're lucky. Li Mei's gaze flicked between them, disbelief still clouding her features. "This is insane," she whispered. "Han, is this really true?" Han didn't answer immediately. The weight of the truth was too much to bear. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the skepticism, the fear, the pain of discovering that the man she'd known for so long was not who she thought he was. "I didn't ask for this," Han said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't choose it. But it's in me, and I can't change that." Li Mei stepped forward, her hands trembling. "But why didn't you tell me? Why hide it from me? I'm your friend, Han. You don't have to go through this alone." "I know," Han said, the guilt heavy in his chest. "But I couldn't risk you getting hurt. I didn't want you to see me as a monster." She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was gentle, but there was a firmness to it, as if she was grounding him in this moment. "You're not a monster, Han. You're still you. But you need to stop hiding. We can figure this out together." Her words were like a balm to his soul. It felt as though a part of the burden he had been carrying for so long began to lift. For the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, Han allowed himself to believe that he might not be alone in this. "You're sure?" Han asked, looking into her eyes, searching for any hint of doubt. Li Mei nodded, a quiet determination setting in her features. "I'm sure. But you're going to have to explain everything to me. I don't understand it all, but I'll help you. Whatever it takes." There was no going back from this. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a new reality that neither of them fully understood. But in that moment, Han knew that he didn't have to face it alone. Li Mei was here, and together, they would find a way to control the power that was surging inside him. "You don't know what you're asking," Han whispered, his voice shaky. "I don't need to," she replied. "I'm asking because I trust you. And I know you're still the same Han, no matter what you've become. So, tell me what we're going to do about this." Ruan stepped back, giving them space. "This is only the beginning, Han. There's a war coming. The factions are already starting to move. The people who want to control the dinosaur gene, to weaponize it, they'll stop at nothing to get their hands on you." Han's blood ran cold at the mention of war. His mind flashed back to the first time he'd met Ruan, to the fear that had been hidden beneath the professor's calm demeanor. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of everything, the balance of power, the struggle for survival. He was a key player in something far larger than he could have ever imagined. "You need to learn to control it, Han," Ruan said, his voice serious. "If you don't, the world will tear itself apart. You won't just be fighting for your life, you'll be fighting for everyone's." Han nodded slowly, the weight of his responsibility sinking in. He glanced at Li Mei, the woman who had just learned the truth about him, who had still chosen to stand by him. She was his anchor, his strength. And together, they would have to navigate the chaos ahead. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "I'll learn to control it. I'll fight. But I need your help." Li Mei smiled softly. "You have it, Han. You always have." And so, with the knowledge that the battle ahead would be fierce, Han began his journey of mastery, not just over the dinosaur blood within him, but over the future of humanity itself. He didn't know how it would end, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The world was no longer what it seemed. Dinosaurs, once thought extinct, were alive in the bloodline of warriors who could shape the future. Han had no choice but to step into this world, to become the thing he had always feared, and embraced it as the key to survival. And Li Mei, by his side, unwavering, would help him become what he needed to be.